What if I told you that a 5-year-old's crayon drawing saved a company from bankruptcy and changed the life of a CEO forever? This isn't fiction. This is the incredible true story of how one child's innocent perspective solved a $20 million crisis that had stumped an entire boardroom of executives for months. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the most profound solutions come from the most unexpected places, and why we should never underestimate the wisdom that lives in a child's heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The emergency board meeting had been called for 7 in the morning, but Marcus Chen already knew it was too late. As CEO of Horizon Manufacturing, he stood at the head of the polished conference table on the 38th floor of the Chicago headquarters, watching his executives shuffle through the same reports they'd been analyzing for 3 months. The numbers hadn't changed overnight, and neither had their collective inability to find a solution that wouldn't destroy everything he'd spent 15 years building. $20 million. That's what it would cost to recall every unit of their flagship industrial cooling system, after discovering a design flaw that rendered them potentially dangerous in extreme weather conditions. The legal team estimated lawsuits could reach twice that amount if they didn't act quickly. The manufacturing team insisted the redesign would take at least 18 months. The marketing department warned that their reputation might never recover, and the CFO had delivered the final blow that morning. They simply didn't have the capital to survive both the recall and the redesign without declaring bankruptcy. Marcus had built Horizon from a small family operation inherited from his father into one of the most respected names in industrial climate control. Their systems cooled data centers, hospitals, and manufacturing plants across the Midwest. But success had made him cautious, and caution had led to the very conservatism that now threatened to destroy them. While competitors had embraced newer technologies and flexible manufacturing processes, Horizon had doubled down on traditional methods that were proving impossibly expensive to modify. The irony wasn't lost on him that the company's strength had become its fatal weakness. Their reputation for reliability was built on systems designed to last decades. But that same engineering philosophy made rapid adaptation nearly impossible. As he looked around the table at his vice presidents and department heads, Marcus saw the same helpless frustration reflected in every face. These were brilliant people who had helped build Horizon's success, but they were trapped by the same thinking that had created the crisis. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, his sister, and the only family he had left since his wife Emma's death 3 years earlier. "Don't forget, Danny has that school thing at 3. I can pick him up if you're still stuck in crisis mode." Marcus glanced at his watch and realized he'd already missed breakfast with his 5-year-old son, the 3rd time this week. Danny had been staying with Sarah more often lately, and Marcus knew his sister was beginning to worry about the toll his obsession with saving the company was taking on both of them. The meeting dragged on for another 2 hours, covering the same ground they'd covered dozens of times before. Every potential solution led to the same dead end. They needed money they didn't have, time they couldn't afford, or technology that didn't exist. As his executives filed out to return to their departments and continue the same futile research they'd been conducting for months, Marcus preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The problems at Horizon Manufacturing ran deeper than a single design flaw, though Marcus Chen had only begun to understand this in the sleepless nights following that disastrous board meeting. The company's crisis was rooted in 15 years of decisions that had seemed prudent at the time, but had collectively created a business model as rigid and unchangeable as the industrial systems they manufactured. When Marcus had inherited the company from his father, Robert Chen, it had been a modest operation with 47 employees and a reputation for building cooling systems that lasted forever. Robert had been a traditional engineer who believed in over-engineering everything, creating products so durable and reliable that customers rarely needed replacements. It was a philosophy that had served the company well in an era when businesses valued longevity over innovation. But the world had changed faster than Horizon had adapted. Marcus had expanded the company aggressively, driven by a combination of ambition and the pressure he felt to honor his father's legacy. He'd hired the best engineers money could buy, invested in state-of-the-art manufacturing equipment, and secured contracts with major corporations who appreciated Horizon's reputation for quality. Revenue had grown from $8 million to over $200 million in just 12 years, and Marcus had been featured on the cover of Industrial Weekly as one of the Midwest's most promising young CEOs. But growth had come at a cost that Marcus was only now beginning to calculate. The company had become increasingly specialized, focusing on large-scale industrial systems that took months to design and manufacture. Their engineering department had grown from 5 people to over 60. But they all shared the same methodical, perfectionist approach that Robert Chen had instilled in the company culture. Innovation meant refinement of existing designs rather than revolutionary thinking. Risk-taking was discouraged in favor of proven methodologies. The manufacturing facility itself reflected this philosophy. The factory floor in suburban Chicago housed millions of dollars worth of specialized equipment, designed to produce their specific line of cooling systems with extraordinary precision. The machinery was impressive, capable of tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, but it was also inflexible. Retooling for a new design would require months of reconfiguration and millions in additional investment. Marcus had convinced himself that this approach was sustainable because their customer base seemed equally committed to traditional values. Hospitals, data centers, and manufacturing plants wanted cooling systems that would operate reliably for 20 or 30 years without major maintenance. Horizon's reputation for delivering exactly that had insulated them from the rapid changes affecting other industries. While technology companies rose and fell with bewildering speed, industrial infrastructure moved at a more measured pace that seemed to favor Horizon's methodical approach. The wake-up call had come from an unexpected source. 3 months earlier, Tommy Rodriguez, Horizon's newest junior engineer, had discovered the design flaw that was now threatening to destroy the company. Tommy was fresh out of Northwestern University, hired because Marcus wanted to inject some young energy into their engineering department. He'd been reviewing stress calculations for their Series 5000 cooling units when he noticed that the mounting brackets could fail under extreme thermal expansion, potentially causing catastrophic system failure in buildings that experienced rapid temperature changes. The discovery had sent shockwaves through the company not just because of the safety implications, but because it revealed how isolated Horizon had become from real-world applications of their products. The engineering team had been so focused on perfecting their designs in laboratory conditions that they'd lost touch with the increasingly complex environments where their systems were actually installed. Modern buildings used sophisticated climate control algorithms that created thermal stresses the Horizon engineers had never anticipated. Even more disturbing was the realization that their quality control processes, despite being exhaustively thorough, had been asking the wrong questions. They'd tested every component to destruction, verified every weld and connection, and documented every specification with obsessive precision. But they'd never asked whether their fundamental design assumptions were still valid in a rapidly changing world. The financial implications had become clear immediately. The Series 5000 represented 60% of Horizon's revenue over the past 2 years. They'd installed over 8,000 units in critical facilities across North America. A recall would require not just replacing the units, but covering the costs of system downtime in hospitals and data centers, where interruption could mean life-or-death consequences or millions in lost revenue. Marcus had initially hoped they could engineer a retrofit solution, something that would allow them to modify existing installations without complete replacement. But the mounting bracket flaw was so fundamental to the design that any fix would essentially require rebuilding each unit from scratch. The engineering team had explored dozens of alternatives, but their methodical approach to problem-solving, usually an asset, had become a liability in a situation that demanded rapid innovation. The competitive landscape had also shifted in ways that made Horizon's crisis even more threatening. While they'd been perfecting their traditional approach, smaller companies had embraced modular design philosophies that made rapid adaptation possible. These competitors couldn't match Horizon's reputation for durability, but they could respond to changing market conditions with an agility that Horizon's infrastructure couldn't support. Marcus found himself trapped between 2 impossible choices. He could authorize the $20 million recall and likely bankruptcy the company, or he could attempt to cover up the flaw and risk both legal catastrophe and the destruction of everything his father had built. Neither option felt like something he could live with, but the mathematics of the situation seemed to offer no third alternative. The personal toll had been devastating. Marcus had thrown himself into finding a solution with the same intensity he'd once applied to growing the company, working 18-hour days and turning every conversation into a desperate search for answers. His relationship with his 5-year-old son Danny had suffered tremendously. The boy who had once run to greet his father at the door now barely looked up from his toys when Marcus arrived home, usually long after bedtime. Sarah had been patient, taking care of Danny during Marcus's increasingly frequent absences, but even she was beginning to show signs of strain. She'd built her own successful career as a graphic designer and had her own life to manage. The arrangement that had worked when Marcus needed occasional help with childcare was becoming an unfair burden as his crisis deepened. Danny seemed to sense the tension even when Marcus tried to hide it. The cheerful, curious child who had always peppered his father with questions about everything from why airplanes stayed in the sky to how refrigerators made things cold had become quieter, more withdrawn. His kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had mentioned that Danny seemed distracted in class, often staring out the window instead of participating in activities he'd previously enjoyed. The guilt Marcus felt about neglecting his son was almost as crushing as the pressure to save the company. Emma had made him promise during those final weeks in the hospital that he would always put Danny first. She'd seen how easily Marcus could become consumed by work, and she'd worried about what would happen to their son if Marcus lost himself in the pursuit of business success. Marcus was breaking that promise daily, choosing emergency meetings over bedtime stories and crisis management over Saturday morning pancakes. The irony was that Danny represented everything Marcus was fighting to preserve. The company wasn't just a business. It was the foundation of their financial security, the source of health insurance and college savings, and the legacy Marcus hoped to pass on someday just as his father had passed it to him. But in his desperate attempt to save that legacy, he was sacrificing the relationship that gave it meaning. Late at night, when the office was empty and the crisis felt most overwhelming, Marcus would sometimes find himself staring at the framed photo on his desk. It showed him and Danny at Navy Pier the previous summer, both of them grinning widely as they shared cotton candy and watched the boats on Lake Michigan. Danny had been fascinated by everything that day, asking endless questions about how the Ferris wheel worked, why the water looked different colors, and whether the seagulls had families like people did. It had been one of those perfect father-son moments that Emma had always encouraged Marcus to treasure. Now, 3 months into the crisis, Marcus couldn't remember the last time he'd seen that kind of joy in his son's eyes, or felt that kind of connection between them. The company he was fighting so hard to save was destroying the relationship that mattered most, but he couldn't see any way to step back from the fight without losing everything. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable, and it happened on a Thursday afternoon when Marcus Chen felt like he was drowning in his own desperation. He'd been staying late at the office every night for weeks, poring over engineering reports and financial projections that all led to the same devastating conclusion. The recall was inevitable, and Horizon Manufacturing was running out of time before the board would have no choice but to begin bankruptcy proceedings. Danny had been asking to visit Daddy's work for months, a request that Marcus had been deflecting with promises of maybe next week and when things calmed down a little. But Sarah had finally put her foot down that morning, insisting that Marcus needed to spend time with his son before the stress of the crisis damaged their relationship permanently. She'd practically forced Danny into Marcus's car, declaring that she had her own deadlines to meet and couldn't continue being a full-time surrogate parent. The 5-year-old had been unusually quiet during the drive to the office, his small hands folded carefully in his lap as he watched the Chicago skyline grow larger through the car window. Marcus had tried to make conversation, asking about kindergarten and Danny's friends, but his son's responses were brief and polite in a way that broke Marcus's heart. This wasn't the chattering, enthusiastic child who had once filled car rides with endless questions and observations. When they arrived at Horizon's headquarters, Danny's eyes widened at the scale of the building and the bustling activity in the lobby. Marcus had forgotten how impressive the corporate environment could seem to a child. The marble floors, the curved reception desk with its wall of monitors displaying company achievements, and the constant flow of employees in business attire created an atmosphere of importance and urgency that even a 5-year-old could sense. Marcus had planned to set Danny up in his office with some coloring books and tablets, hoping to squeeze in a few more hours of crisis management while keeping his son nearby. But the engineering department had requested an emergency meeting to discuss their latest failed attempt at a retrofit solution, and Marcus found himself torn between parental responsibility and the crushing weight of saving 300 jobs. That's when he made a decision that would change everything, though he couldn't know it at the time. Instead of leaving Danny alone in his office or disrupting Sarah's day by calling her to pick him up, Marcus brought his son to the engineering department's conference room. The meeting was supposed to be brief, just a status update on Tommy Rodriguez's latest calculations, and Marcus figured Danny could sit quietly in the corner while the adults discussed technical details that would be meaningless to a kindergartner. The engineering team had been working around the clock, and it showed. Tommy Rodriguez looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usually neat appearance disheveled and his eyes red from staring at computer screens. The other engineers weren't much better. Their conference table covered with printouts, technical drawings, and empty coffee cups that told the story of another all-night session that had yielded no solutions. Tommy was in the middle of explaining why their latest approach wouldn't work when Danny, who had been sitting quietly in the corner with his coloring book, suddenly spoke up. "Why don't you just make it like a Lego?" he asked, his small voice cutting through the technical jargon that had been filling the room. The engineers stopped talking and turned to look at the 5-year-old, some with amusement and others with barely concealed irritation at the interruption. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment. "Danny, Daddy's having an important meeting. Let the grown-ups talk, okay?" But Danny wasn't deterred by the adult attention focused on him. "I mean, when my Lego spaceship breaks, I don't throw away all the pieces," he continued, his tone matter-of-fact in the way that only children can manage. "I just take apart the broken part and put in new pieces that fit better. Then it's fixed. And it's even cooler than before because I can make it different colors or add new stuff." The room fell silent. Marcus was about to apologize for his son's interruption when he noticed that Tommy Rodriguez was staring at Danny with an expression of intense concentration. The young engineer's eyes had taken on the same focused look he got when he was working through a complex problem. But instead of dismissing the child's comment, he seemed to be processing it seriously. "Wait," Tommy said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wait. He turned to his laptop and began typing furiously, his fingers flying across the keyboard as ideas began cascading through his mind. The other engineers watched in confusion as Tommy pulled up the technical drawings for the Series 5000 cooling system and began highlighting different components. "What if the kid's right?" Tommy said, his excitement building as he spoke. "What if we're approaching this completely wrong? We've been trying to fix the mounting bracket within the existing design parameters, but what if we treated the whole system like modular components instead?" Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Horizon's senior mechanical engineer, leaned forward to study Tommy's screen. "You're talking about a fundamental redesign philosophy," she said cautiously. "That's not a retrofit. That's a complete rethinking of how we build these systems." "Exactly!" Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious as he began sketching rapidly on the whiteboard. "Look, the mounting bracket fails because it's trying to handle all the thermal stress for the entire system. But what if we distributed that stress across multiple smaller connection points? What if each major component had its own mounting interface that could be swapped out independently?" As Tommy drew, Marcus found himself thinking about Danny's Lego analogy in ways he'd never considered before. His son had an entire room full of Lego sets at home, and Marcus had watched him build and rebuild the same kits dozens of times, each iteration slightly different as Danny experimented with new configurations. The boy never seemed frustrated when Marcus Chen, the production manager who shared Marcus's surname but no family relation. "If we could design systems with truly interchangeable components, we could customize installations without starting from scratch every time. And maintenance becomes completely different," added Dr. Walsh, her initial skepticism giving way to genuine interest. "Instead of replacing entire units, customers could upgrade or repair specific components as needed. The lifetime value proposition changes completely." Danny had returned to his coloring during the adults' increasingly animated discussion, but Marcus noticed that his son was no longer using the generic coloring book Sarah had packed. Instead, he'd found a piece of blank paper and was drawing something with intense concentration, his tongue poking out slightly, in the way it always did when he was focused on something important. The engineering meeting stretched on for 3 hours, longer than any session they'd held since the crisis began, but this time the energy in the room was electric, rather than desperate. Tommy's initial insight had sparked a chain reaction of ideas, with each team member building on concepts that had emerged from a 5-year-old's simple observation about how toys work. By the time they broke for dinner, the engineers had outlined a completely new approach to industrial cooling system design. Instead of monolithic units that required complete replacement when they failed, they envisioned modular systems where individual components could be upgraded, replaced, or reconfigured based on changing needs. The recall would still be necessary, but instead of bankruptcy, it could become the foundation for a revolutionary new product line that would leapfrog their competition. "We'll need to run extensive testing," Dr. Walsh cautioned, her engineer's training asserting itself even as her excitement was obvious. "And the initial development costs will be significant. But if this works, we're not just solving the current crisis. We're potentially changing the entire industry." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. A genuine spark of hope that didn't depend on avoiding disaster, but on embracing a completely new possibility. As the engineers began packing up their materials, already making plans for prototype development and testing schedules, he looked over at Danny, who was still absorbed in his drawing. "What are you working on, buddy?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside his son's chair. Danny looked up with the first real smile Marcus had seen from him in weeks. "It's our house," Danny said, holding up his drawing. "But I made it better. See, I put rocket boosters on the bottom so we can go visit Mommy in heaven whenever we want, and I added a swimming pool on the roof because that would be cool, and look, there's a special door just for dogs even though we don't have a dog yet." Marcus studied his son's creation, seeing not just the whimsical additions of a child's imagination, but something deeper. Danny had taken something familiar and reimagined it as something better, adding elements that served no practical purpose except to make it more joyful and interesting. He'd approached the drawing the same way he approached his Legos, with the assumption that everything could be improved, and that limitations were just invitations to be more creative. "You know what, Danny?" Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "I think you might be the smartest engineer in this whole building." As they packed up to leave the office, Marcus realized that his son had just given him more than a solution to Horizon's crisis. Danny had reminded him that the best innovations often come from the willingness to start over completely, to question assumptions that adults take for granted, and to approach problems with the kind of fearless creativity that most people lose somewhere between childhood and career development. The modular design concept would take months to develop and test, and there was no guarantee it would work in practice the way it looked on Tommy's mounting bracket flaw. Marcus felt like they had a path forward that didn't end in disaster. More importantly, he'd remembered something Emma had tried to tell him during those final conversations in the hospital, that sometimes the most important lessons come from the people we're supposed to be teaching. The conversation that changed everything happened 3 weeks later, not in a boardroom or executive office, but on the living room floor of Marcus's suburban Chicago home, surrounded by Danny's Lego creations and the remnants of a pizza dinner they'd shared while building an elaborate space station together. It was the first evening Marcus had spent entirely focused on his son since the crisis began, and the contrast with his recent behavior was so stark that Danny had asked if his daddy was feeling sick. Marcus had called an emergency board meeting for the following morning to present Tommy Rodriguez's modular design concept, but the engineering team's preliminary tests had revealed challenges that made him question whether they were chasing an impossible dream. The new approach would require a complete overhaul of their manufacturing processes, retraining of their entire workforce, and an initial investment that would push the company even deeper into financial jeopardy before any revenue could be generated. Sarah had stopped by that evening to drop off some of Danny's clothes and had found Marcus sitting on the floor, mechanically sorting Lego pieces, while his son chattered excitedly about his latest creation. She'd taken one look at her brother's face and sent Danny to his room to get ready for bed, settling beside Marcus with the determined expression she'd worn since childhood, when she'd decided someone needed a dose of uncomfortable truth. "You're gonna lose him," she said without preamble, her voice quiet but firm. "Not to some custody battle or tragedy, but because you're disappearing right in front of his eyes. Emma made me promise to tell you if this ever happened, and it's happening." The words hit Marcus harder than any financial projection or engineering report. He'd been so consumed with saving the company that he'd convinced himself his sacrifices were necessary. that working 18-hour days and missing bedtime stories was the price of preserving Danny's future security. But looking at his sister's concerned face, he realized he'd been using his son's welfare to justify behavior that was actually damaging the relationship that mattered most. "I'm trying to save everything Dad built," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to make sure Danny has the same opportunities I had, the same foundation. If I lose the company, I lose everything I can give him." Sarah reached over and picked up one of Danny's Lego spaceships, examining the intricate design their 5-year-old nephew had created from his own imagination rather than following any instruction manual. "Look at this," she said, holding up the colorful creation. Danny didn't need expensive pieces or fancy sets to build something amazing. He just needed time and attention and the freedom to be creative. That's what kids actually need from their parents, not financial security or prestigious legacies. The truth of her words settled over Marcus like a weight he'd been carrying without realizing it. He thought about the drawing Danny had made in the engineering meeting, the simple sketch that had sparked a revolution in how Horizon approached product design. His son hadn't needed years of education or sophisticated tools to see a solution that had escaped a room full of highly trained professionals. He just needed someone to listen to his ideas and take them seriously. "Emma used to say that you had 2 choices as a parent," Sarah continued, her voice softening as she remembered her sister-in-law. "You could spend your time building a perfect world for your child." Months finally began to fall. The pressure of the crisis, the guilt over neglecting Danny, and the fear of failing his father's legacy had created a knot of anxiety in his chest that had been growing tighter every day. But sitting on his living room floor, surrounded by the evidence of his son's creativity and imagination, he realized he'd been fighting the wrong battle entirely. When Danny emerged from his bedroom in his pajamas, ready for the bedtime routine they'd been skipping too often lately, Marcus made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. He was going to tell his son the truth about what was happening at the company, not the sanitized version he'd been offering when Danny asked why Daddy seemed so worried, but the real story of problems and uncertainty, and the possibility that everything might change. "Danny, can we talk about something important?" Marcus asked, patting the couch beside him. His son climbed up eagerly, sensing that this was different from their usual brief conversations about school or weekend plans. Marcus found himself explaining the concept of business challenges in terms a 5-year-old could understand, talking about how sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that affect lots of people, and how finding solutions requires admitting when something isn't working and being brave enough to try completely new approaches. He told Danny about the mounting bracket problem, the recall, and the financial crisis, but he also told him about Tommy's excitement over the modular design concept and how a simple observation about Legos had changed everything. "Are we going to be okay?" Danny asked, his small hand finding Marcus's as they talked. It was the kind of direct question that children ask when they sense adult anxiety, and Marcus felt the weight of providing an honest answer that wouldn't create unnecessary fear. "I don't know exactly what's going to happen with the company," Marcus admitted, feeling a strange relief in acknowledging uncertainty rather than projecting false confidence. "But I know that we're going to be okay because we have each other, and because we're going to face whatever comes next together, instead of me trying to handle everything by myself." Danny was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness that children bring to important conversations. Then he said something that would stay with Marcus for the rest of his life. "Maybe the company needs to be like my Legos too. Maybe it needs to break apart so you can build it better." The wisdom in those words was so profound that Marcus felt his entire perspective shift. He'd been thinking about the crisis as something to survive, a disaster to minimize, a problem that required returning to the safety of the status quo as quickly as possible. But Danny was suggesting something far more radical, that destruction could be the first step toward creation, that sometimes the best solution was to embrace change rather than resist it. That night, after Danny had fallen asleep, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and wrote a presentation, unlike any he'd ever prepared for a board meeting. Instead of focusing on damage control and risk mitigation, he outlined a vision for transforming Horizon manufacturing into something entirely new. The modular design concept wasn't just a solution to the current crisis, it was an opportunity to revolutionize how the company approached innovation, customer service, and market adaptation. The financial projections were still daunting, and the risks were enormous, but Marcus realized he'd been looking at the situation backward. Instead of asking how to preserve what they'd built, He started asking what they could build if they were willing to start over with everything they'd learned. The recall would still cost $20 million, but it could become the foundation for a 30-year competitive advantage if they had the courage to reimagine their entire business model. As he worked through the night, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since Emma's death, a sense of excitement about the future rather than anxiety. A company his father had built had been perfect for its time, but times had changed, and trying to preserve the past was preventing them from embracing possibilities that Robert Chen could never have imagined. When Sarah found him the next morning, still at the kitchen table surrounded by notes and sketches, she could see that something fundamental had shifted. "You look different," she said, pouring coffee for both of them as Danny ate breakfast and got ready for school. "I feel different," Marcus admitted. "I think I've been asking the wrong questions. Instead of trying to save what we have, maybe it's time to build what we need." 6 months later, Marcus Chen stood in the redesigned Horizon manufacturing facility, watching Danny demonstrate the new modular cooling system to a group of potential investors. His 5-year-old son had become something of a company mascot. His simple explanations of complex engineering concepts, charming executives who had initially been skeptical about investing in a company that had nearly gone bankrupt. The transformation had been more dramatic than anyone had imagined possible. The recall had indeed cost $20 million, but the modular redesign had attracted venture capital funding that valued the company at 3 times its previous worth. Major corporations were lining up to pilot the new systems, drawn by the promise of cooling solutions that could be upgraded and customized without complete replacement. Tommy Rodriguez had been promoted to head of innovation, leading a team that now approached every design challenge with what they called Danny's question. What would this look like if we built it with Legos? The simple framework had revolutionized their engineering culture, encouraging rapid prototyping and iterative improvement over the perfectionist paralysis that had nearly destroyed them. But the most important change wasn't visible in quarterly reports or patent applications. Marcus had learned to leave the office by 5:30 every day, a discipline that had initially felt like playing hooky, but had become the foundation of everything else that mattered. He and Danny had established new rituals. Wednesday evening Lego building sessions where they collaborated on increasingly ambitious projects, Saturday morning pancake breakfasts where Danny shared kindergarten gossip, and Marcus talked about work challenges in terms his son could understand. The drawing that had started everything now hung framed in Marcus's office, not as a cute memento, but as a daily reminder of the wisdom that lived in unexpected places. Danny's simple sketch of a house with rocket boosters and a rooftop swimming pool had become the company's unofficial symbol of fearless creativity, a visual representation of their commitment to imagining better solutions rather than accepting limitations. Sarah had noticed the change immediately, commenting that her brother seemed to have rediscovered something he'd lost after Emma's death. Marcus realized she was right. He'd found his way back to the kind of present moment awareness that his wife had always encouraged, the ability to find joy and possibility in ordinary moments rather than constantly worrying about future security. Danny's teacher reported that he'd become more confident and engaged at school, volunteering answers and helping classmates with building projects. The quiet withdrawal that had worried everyone had been replaced by the natural curiosity and enthusiasm that had always been his strongest qualities. Most importantly, he'd started asking his father the endless questions that had once driven Marcus to distraction but now felt like the most precious conversations of his day. The crisis that had nearly destroyed Horizon manufacturing had become the catalyst for something neither Marcus nor his father could have envisioned. They were no longer just another industrial cooling company competing on reliability and price. They had become pioneers of becoming obsolete. As Marcus watched Danny explain to the investors why modular design was just like Legos but for grown-ups, he understood that his son had given him far more than a business solution. Danny had reminded him that the most important innovations often come from the willingness to see familiar problems with fresh eyes, to question assumptions that adults accept without thinking, and to approach challenges with the kind of playful creativity that most people abandon sometime between childhood and career.